the frozen dawn. Imagine a morning where the first thing you see isn't your smartphone screen, but your own breath crystallizing in the air. Imagine waking up under 4 layers of heavy wool blankets, yet your nose feels like a piece of ice. There is no thermostat to turn up. There is no hot shower waiting. Outside, the year is 1905, and a great freeze has gripped the land. For the Edwardians, winter wasn't a season for hot cocoa and Netflix. It was a brutal, daily battle for survival. Welcome to the frozen reality of a century ago. The wake-up call. In the early 1900s, the bedroom was often the coldest place in the house. Why? Because coal was expensive. You didn't waste it on a room where you were just sleeping. As the sun barely peeks through the frost-covered window panes, you realize the water in the porcelain pitcher next to your bed has frozen solid overnight. The cold is heavy. It's a physical weight. To get out from under those blankets is an act of bravery. Your floorboards are ice cold, and every step creaks in the silent, freezing air. This is the frozen dawn, the start of the 16-hour workday where your only goal is to stay warm enough to see tomorrow. The first task to fire the house is a tomb until the kitchen range is lit. In an Edwardian home, the range was the heart, the lungs, and the soul of the household. It provided the heat, the hot water, and the cooked food, but it was a demanding master. Before you can even think of warmth, you have to clean out the clinkers, the stony residue of yesterday's coal. Your hands are numb, your fingers stiff. You strike a match, a precious commodity, and nurse the kindling into a flame. It takes an hour for the kitchen to become bearable. Until then, you move like a shadow in the dark, shivering uncontrollably as your body tries to generate its own heat. The psychology of the cold. We often think of people in the past as tougher than us. While they were certainly resilient, the psychological toll was immense. The winter meant isolation. If the snow was deep, no one was coming to help. There was no radio, no telephone for the common farmer. The silence of a 1900s winter was deafening. You were alone with the cracking of the ice and the whistling of the wind through the ill-fitting door frames. Suggested titles for this series: The Great Freeze, 12 Days of Edwardian Survival, Life Before Heaters, How They Didn't Die in 1900, 90 Days of Ice, The Brutal Reality of History, The Art of Layering. In our modern world, we have smart fabrics, thermal tech, and lightweight down jackets that weigh less than a loaf of bread. But in the winter of 1905, staying warm was a heavy, itchy, and exhausting business. If you didn't dress correctly, the damp cold would seep into your bones, leading to rheumatism or worse, pneumonia, the captain of the men of death. To the Edwardians, clothing was a fashion statement. It was your primary armor against a hostile environment. Let's look at the layers that stood between a human being and a frozen grave. The base layer, the scratchy shield. Long before the morning tea was poured, the struggle began with a union suit or long johns. Unlike the soft cotton blends we wear today, these were made of thick, heavy wool. If you were poor, the wool was coarse and untreated, feeling like sandpaper against your skin. Why wool? Because the Edwardians understood a scientific truth. Wool is a miracle fiber. Even when damp from sweat or melting snow, wool retains its insulating properties. It traps air in its crimped fibers, creating a pocket of warmth generated by your own body heat. But there was a price to pay: the winter itch. For 4 months of the year, your skin was in a constant state of irritation, but that itch was a sign that you were staying alive. The middle layers, trapping the heat. The secret to Edwardian survival was not one thick coat, but many thin layers. Over the long underwear came the flannel shirt, usually made of a wool-cotton blend. For men, a waistcoat vest was mandatory. It wasn't just for style. It provided an extra layer of protection for the vital organs in the chest and abdomen. For women, the layering was even more complex and burdensome. Over the chemise and corset came the petticoat, sometimes 2 or 3 of them. These were made of heavy flannel or quilted fabric. While these layers provided warmth, they added significant weight. Imagine walking through 6 inches of snow while dragging 3 layers of floor-length wool skirts. Every step was a workout, and every workout produced sweat, which was the enemy. If your inner layers got too wet from perspiration, and then you stopped moving, the moisture would turn ice cold, chilling your core instantly. The outer shell, the heavy-duty protection. The greatcoat was the final piece of the puzzle. For a working-class man, this was often the most expensive item he owned. Made of melton wool, a fabric so thick and tightly woven it was almost waterproof. These coats were designed to last a lifetime. They were so heavy that putting one on felt like someone was placing their hands on your shoulders and pushing down. But the coat wasn't enough. In the damp winters of the UK or the North American plains, you needed a barrier against the wind. This is where leather and fur came in for the wealthy, while the poor used heavy wax-treated canvases or simply wrapped themselves in extra woolen shawls. The extremities, the battle for toes and fingers. The most common injury in an Edwardian winter wasn't a cold or flu. It was chilblains. These were painful, itchy swellings on the fingers and toes caused by repeated exposure to cold and then sudden heat. To prevent this, footwear was a priority. Leather boots were greased with tallow, animal fat, or beeswax to make them waterproof. Inside the boots, people would stuff dried hay or old newspapers. It sounds primitive, but paper is an incredible insulator. The air trapped between the sheets of newsprint acted as a thermal barrier, keeping the heat from escaping to the soles of the feet into the frozen ground. Gloves were rarely the thin, stylish things we see in movies. For the laborer, they were thick mittens, often knitted by a mother or wife, with a leather palm stitched on for grip. Mittens were superior to gloves because keeping the fingers together allowed them to share warmth, a small but vital tip for survival. Class warfare, in the cold, the art of layering, also highlighted the brutal class divide of the era. The wealthy had access to silk linings, which reduced the itch of the wool, and luxurious furs like mink or sable that were windproof and incredibly warm. The poor, however, relied on shoddy. Shoddy was a fabric made by grinding up old woolen rags and spinning them into new, low-quality yarn. It was heavy, it smelled when it got wet, and it wasn't nearly as warm as virgin wool. While the rich looked like winter royalty in their velvet and fur, the poor looked like bundles of rags, quite literally wearing layers of history, just to keep their pulse steady. The psychological weight. By the time an Edwardian was fully dressed to go outside, they might be carrying an extra 10 to 15 pounds of clothing. This physical burden contributed to the exhaustion of winter. You didn't just walk, you labored. You didn't just sit, you remained encased in your fabric armor. But as you stepped out the door and the minus 10 degrees Celsius wind hit your face, you thanked every single layer. You were a walking thermos, a self-contained heating unit wrapped in the best technology the 19th century had to offer. The hearth of the home. In the modern world, warmth is invisible. We flick a switch, a silent furnace hums in the basement, and heat flows through vents. But in 1905, warmth was a living, breathing, and hungry beast. It lived in the kitchen, inside a massive black iron structure known as a range. This wasn't just an appliance. It was a heart of the home. If the fire died, the house died. If the fire grew too wild, the house burned. Managing the hearth was a full-time job that required skill, muscle, and a constant battle against the soot that threatened to choke the lungs of every inhabitant. The black iron beast. The Edwardian kitchen range was a marvel of Victorian engineering and a nightmare of maintenance. Made of heavy cast iron, it stood as a dark monument against the kitchen wall. It featured a firebox in the center, an oven on one side, and a water boiler on the other, for the woman of the house or the servant. The day didn't start with a cup of tea. It started with blacking the range. Every few days, the iron had to be polished with a graphite paste called black lead to prevent it from rusting in the damp winter air. It was back-breaking work that left your hands stained gray for days. But a clean range was a point of pride. It showed that even in the depths of a brutal winter, the household had not given up its standards. The fuel, black gold. In the early 1900s, coal was the lifeblood of the nation. Thousands of men toiled deep underground to provide the black gold that kept the country from freezing. For a typical household, the arrival of the coal man was the most important event of the week. He would carry heavy burlap sacks, weighing over 100 pounds each, down into the cellar. Coal was expensive. A sudden spike in prices during particularly harsh winter could mean the difference between eating meat or eating dry bread. Every lump of coal was counted. You didn't just throw a shovelful on the fire. You placed it strategically. You learned the language of the fire, how to bank it at night, so that a few glowing embers remained in the morning, saving you the struggle of starting from scratch with expensive kindling. The morning ritual of ash. Before a new fire could be lit, the remains of the old one had to be dealt with. This was the ash pit. Cleaning out the ash was the messiest job in the house. Fine, gray dust would rise into the air, settling on the furniture, the food, and into the lungs of whoever was cleaning it. This ash wasn't just waste, though. In the spirit of Edwardian frugality, it was often recycled. Sifted ash was used to soak up spills, mixed with night soil waste for the garden, or even used as a primitive abrasive to clean metal pots. Nothing was wasted because, in the winter, resources were too precious to throw away. The science of heat, the convection struggle. One of the greatest challenges of the 1900s was that heat didn't travel. The kitchen might be a sweltering 25 degrees Celsius, 77 degrees Fahrenheit because of the stove, but just 10 feet away in a hallway, the temperature dropped to near freezing. To combat this, Edwardians used draft excluders, long, snake-like bags filled with sand or sawdust placed at the bottom of doors. They understood that the hot air from the stove would rise and try to escape, while the heavy, cold air from outside would crawl along the floor like a ghost. Life in the winter was a constant movement between zones. You stayed in the kitchen as long as possible. When you had to move to the parlor or the bedroom, you did so quickly, carrying a hot brick wrapped in flannel or a copper bed warmer filled with coals to keep your hands from numbing. The hidden killer, carbon monoxide, with all the doors shut tight and every crack stuffed with rags to keep the heat in, a new danger emerged, the silent killer. Coal fires produce carbon monoxide in poorly ventilated houses, or if the chimney flue was blocked by soot or a bird's nest, the gas would build up. Edwardians didn't have digital detectors. They relied on common sense and traditional signs. If the family became unusually drowsy, or if the pet dog seemed lethargic, it was a sign to crack a window, even if it meant letting in the sub-zero air. The choice was often between freezing or suffocation. Many families went to sleep in a warm room and simply never woke up, victims of the very fire that was supposed to keep them safe. The sound of the hearth. There's a specific sound to an Edwardian winter. The rhythmic clink-clink of the coal shovel against the iron grate, the roar of the chimney when the wind caught it, and the occasional pop of a gas pocket in the coal. For the children of the house, the hearth was the center of their universe. It was where they did their homework by the flickering orange light, where they toasted pieces of bread on long forks, and where they listened to their elders tell stories of even worse winters from the past. The fire was more than a utility. It was a member of the family. It required feeding, cleaning, and attention, and in return, it provided the only thing that made the dark, frozen months bearable. Light in life. Conclusion of Part 3. But the fire was only half the battle. To keep the fire of the human body burning, you needed calories and lots of them. In a world where the milk froze in the bottle and the meat turned to stone in the larder, how did the Edwardians feed themselves? Breakfast of survivors. In our modern world, we often count calories to lose weight. In 1905, you counted calories to stay alive. A body living in a house with no central heating, performing manual labor in sub-zero temperatures, burns energy at a terrifying rate. To survive an Edwardian winter, you couldn't rely on a light salad or smoothie. You needed fat. You needed sugar. You needed heavy food that would sit in your stomach like a hot coal. Today, we explore the survival diet, the high-calorie fuel that powered the 12-hour workdays of a frozen century. The frozen larder. Before the sun was even up, the mistress of the house faced her first challenge, the larder. In 1905, there were no electric refrigerators, but in winter, the entire pantry became a freezer. This sounds convenient, but it was a nightmare. The milk didn't just get cold. It expanded as it froze, often pushing the cardboard cap off the bottle or cracking the glass. The butter was as hard as a brick, requiring it to be placed near the stove for 30 minutes before it was even spreadable. Worst of all was the meat. If you had a joint of beef or a ham hanging in the larder, it would be frozen solid. Cutting it required a saw, not a knife. Every meal required hours of pre-thawing near the kitchen range. The Edwardian kitchen was a constant cycle of defrosting, boiling, and stewing. The morning porridge, the foundation, the cornerstone of the Edwardian winter breakfast was porridge, but not the thin, watery version we see today. This was steel-cut oats. Boil for hours until it reached a thick, glue-like consistency. It was seasoned with a pinch of salt and, if you could afford it, a dollop of golden syrup or heavy cream. Oats were the perfect survival food. They are complex carbohydrates that release energy slowly throughout the morning. For a schoolchild walking 3 miles through the snow or a laborer heading to the docks, that bowl of porridge was their internal furnace. It provided a steady stream of heat as the body digested the dense grains. The power of fat, lard and dripping. If porridge was a foundation, fat was a fuel. In the early 20th century, fat wasn't a dirty word. It was a lifesaver. The most common spread wasn't expensive butter, but dripping. This was a cold, congealed fat left over from roasting meat. A thick slice of toasted bread, spread heavily with beef dripping and sprinkled with salt and pepper, was a standard breakfast or snack. To our modern palates, it sounds unappealing, but to a person whose core temperature was dropping, that animal fat was pure gold. It provided the dense calories needed to maintain thermogenesis, the process by which the body generates heat. Without adequate fat intake, the body would begin to shiver uncontrollably within hours of stepping outside, leading to rapid exhaustion. The tea ritual, liquid warmth. No Edwardian morning was complete without tea, but in winter, tea served a dual purpose. Yes, the caffeine provided a much-needed boost for the dark morning, but the primary function was internal heating. The tea was served scalding hot and loaded with sugar. Sugar was a quick-burning fuel, giving the body an immediate spike in energy to tackle the first chores of the day, like shoveling snow or carrying water. The warmth of the cup also served a practical purpose. It was a way to thaw out frozen fingers before putting on work gloves. In many working-class homes, the teapot stayed on the corner of the kitchen range all day long, being topped up with hot water and fresh leaves, acting as a communal station for quick warmth. The struggle for protein. While oats and fats were plenty, fresh protein was a luxury in the dead of winter. Most families relied on salt pork or bacon. This wasn't the thin, crispy bacon we know. It was thick, salt-cured slabs of fat with a streak of lean meat. The salt served two purposes. It preserved the meat without the need for ice, and it encouraged the body to retain water, which was strangely helpful in the dry, cold air of winter. Eggs were rare. Chickens often stop laying eggs when the days get short and the temperatures drop. If a family had eggs in January, they were likely water-glassed, an ancient method of preserving eggs by submerging them in a bucket of sodium silicate. These eggs would stay fresh for months, but they were treated like precious jewels, saved for the most grueling days or for the sick. The pudding culture, dinner, usually eaten at midday, was the largest meal. This is where the famous suet puddings came into play. Suet is the hard fat found around the kidneys of cows. Edwardians would mix this fat with flour and dried fruits like raisins to create spotted dick or suet dumplings. These puddings were steamed for hours. They were incredibly dense and heavy. A single serving could contain 800 to 1,000 calories. This was a slow burn, fuel that would get a worker through the freezing afternoon until the sun went down. Conclusion of Part 4. The Edwardian winter diet was a masterpiece of survival. It was built on the understanding that the body is an engine, and an engine cannot run without fuel. They ate with a purpose, to stay warm, to stay strong, and to stay alive. But what happens when you finish your meal and realize there is no water left to wash the dishes? Or worse, no water to drink? In our next part, we look at the most basic necessity of life and how it turned into a frozen nightmare. Water and ice. In the 21st century, we take water for granted. We turn a handle, and an endless stream of clean, temperature-controlled water appears. But in the winter of 1905, water was a stubborn, frozen enemy. In the Edwardian era, if you want a glass of water or a pot for tea, you didn't just turn a tap, you often had to fight for it with an axe. Today, we explore the frozen grid, the era where the most basic necessity of life could disappear overnight, trapped inside pipes of lead and wells of stone. The sound of the axe, the morning break, for the millions of people living in rural areas or small villages, water came from an outdoor pump or communal well. On a morning where the temperature had plummeted to minus 15 degrees Celsius, the scene at the village pump was one of communal struggle. The prime of the pump would have frozen solid. To get the water flowing, you had to perform a ritual. First, you brought out a kettle of boiling water, precious water saved from the night before, and poured it slowly over the iron neck of the pump. You waited for the ice to crack and melt within the mechanism. Only then could you begin the heavy, rhythmic pumping, and you had to be fast. If you pumped too slowly, the water would freeze again before it even hit your bucket. The sound of metal clanking and ice shattering was a true alarm clock of the Edwardian countryside, the nightmare of indoor plumbing. In the cities, modern plumbing was beginning to take hold, but it was primitive and ill-prepared for a deep freeze. Pipes were made of lead or cast iron and were often attached to the exterior of houses or buried just inches beneath the cold brickwork. When water freezes, it expands. In the winter of 1905, the sound of a thump followed by a hiss was the sound of catastrophe. A burst pipe didn't just mean no water. It meant that when the thaw finally came, your home would be flooded with freezing, muddy water. To prevent this, Edwardians would leave their taps dripping all night. They knew that moving water is harder to freeze than standing water. However, this led to a secondary problem. The drains would freeze, and by morning, your sink would be a solid block of ice, overflowing onto the floor. The thaw trap. If your pipes did freeze, the methods for thawing them were terrifyingly dangerous. The common solution was to take a flaming rag soaked in oil or a handheld blow lamp and run it along the lead pipes. In a house filled with wooden beams, hay-filled mattresses, and coal dust, this was a recipe for a house fire. Many Edwardian families survived the cold only to lose their homes to a fire started by a desperate attempt to get the water running again. The laundry ordeal. If obtaining water for drinking was hard, obtaining water for cleaning was an Olympian feat. Wash day in the winter was a multi-day battle. You needed gallons of water to wash the heavy woolen layers we discussed in Part 2. This meant hauling dozens of buckets from the pump, heating them on the kitchen range, which took hours, and then scrubbing the clothes by hand. The real heartbreak came when it was time to dry the clothes. You couldn't hang them outside. They would simply freeze into wooden shapes. A shirt hung on a line in 1905, it would become a flat, frozen board in minutes. If you tried to fold it, the fibers would snap. Most families had to hang their wet laundry on clothes horses inside the kitchen. This turned the only warm room in the house into a damp, humid, and claustrophobic jungle, with a smell of wet wool and coal smoke mixed into a thick, suffocating air. The harvest of ice. While the average person struggled with ice, for some, the ice was a crop. Before the invention of electric refrigeration, ice was harvested from ponds and rivers. Men with long, jagged saws would venture onto frozen lakes, cutting massive blocks of ice that were 2 feet thick. These blocks were hauled by horse-drawn sleds to ice houses, deep underground pits lined with straw and sawdust. Remarkably, if the blocks were packed tightly enough, the ice would stay frozen all the way through the following summer. In 1905, the ice that froze your pipes in January was the same ice that would cool a wealthy man's drink in July. The ice harvesters were the unsung heroes of the winter, working in the most dangerous conditions, often falling through thin ice just to secure this frozen commodity. Hygiene and the sponge reality. Because water was so difficult to transport and heat, full-body baths were rare in the winter. Most people practiced the sponge bath. You would stand in front of the kitchen fire with a small basin of warm water and a rag, washing one section of your body at a time, while the rest of you shivered in the cold air. This lack of water usage wasn't just about laziness. It was about survival. Every drop of water used for washing was a drop of water that had to be hauled, heated, and paid for in coal. In the hierarchy of winter needs, thirst and warmth always sat higher than cleanliness. Conclusion of Part 5. As the sun began to set at 4 p.m., the struggle for water would pause, but the struggle for work continued. For the Edwardian man, the frozen world wasn't just a home, it was a workplace. Whether you were a farmer, a dock worker, or a postman, the ice didn't mean a snow day. It meant your job just got 10 times harder. Out in the element. In our era, a heavy snowstorm often means a remote work day or a canceled school bus. But in 1905, the world did not stop for the snow. There were no snowplows, no salted roads, and no heated cabins and trucks. If you were a laborer, a farmer, or a postman, the Great Freeze wasn't an excuse to stay inside. It was a challenge that tested the very limits of human endurance. To stay home was to lose your wages, and to lose your wages was to starve. Today, we step outside the home and into the brutal reality of the Edwardian outdoor workspace. The silent streets. The first thing you would notice about a 1900s winter morning was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. Snow acts as a natural acoustic insulator, but the silence was also due to the lack of machinery. The only sounds were the crunch-crunch of heavy boots on packed ice and the rhythmic jingle of horse harnesses. The roads were treacherous. In the cities, the mixture of snow, horse manure, and coal secreted a slippery, black slush known as clutch. Walking through it was an exercise in balance. If you fell, you didn't just get wet. You were covered in the filthy remains of the city's industrial waste. For the street sweepers, their job became a nightmare of moving heavy, frozen piles of this sludge just to keep the main thoroughfares open for the horse-drawn omnibuses. The burden of the horse. In 1905, the world ran on horsepower, literally. Horses were the engines of the economy, and in the winter, they suffered more than the humans. A horse slipping on the ice was a catastrophe. If a horse broke a leg, it was usually a death sentence for the animal and a financial disaster for the owner. To combat the ice, blacksmiths were kept busy day and night fitting frost nails or caulkins to horseshoes. These were sharp metal studs that acted like cleats, digging into the ice to provide grip. But even with these, the effort of pulling a heavy load through the snow was immense. You would see horses with steam rising from their bodies like locomotives, their breath forming thick icicles on their muzzles. The horse watering troughs became frozen blocks, and kind owners would carry buckets of warm mash and ale to keep their animals' internal temperatures up. Farming, the endless chore. For the farmer, winter was not a time of rest. While the crops were dormant, the livestock were in constant danger. Sheep could easily become snowed in, trapped in drifts where they would suffocate or freeze, if not found quickly. Farmers had to trek miles through waist-deep snow, often carrying a long pole to poke into drifts, looking for the steam holes created by a buried sheep's breath. Feeding the cattle was a grueling physical labor. Frozen hay had to be pitched, and as we discuss in Part 5, the water supply was a constant battle. The farmer's hands were a map of his struggle. Cracked skin, hacked sores from the cold, and permanent frost-nipped fingertips. There were no waterproof Gore-Tex gloves. There was only grease-soaked wool that eventually froze into the shape of the shovel handle. The postman and the messenger. One of the most respected figures of the Edwardian winter was the postman. In an age before the internet, the mail was the only link between families. The postie was expected to make his rounds regardless of the drifts. Rural postmen often walked 15 to 20 miles a day. In the Great Freeze of the early 1900s, stories emerged of postmen being found leaning against stone walls, frozen to death with their mailbags still gripped tightly. They were the sentinels of communication, and the sight of the red-faced man in his heavy navy blue coat was a symbol of hope for isolated families. They brought the news of the outside world to people who hadn't seen a neighbor in weeks. The danger of whiteouts. Without GPS or paved highways, it was incredibly easy to get lost. A sudden blizzard or whiteout could turn a familiar path into a deadly trap. In the flat plains of North America or the high moors of England, the horizon would disappear. People would lose their sense of direction just yards from their own front door. There are harrowing accounts of Edwardians tying ropes from their back door to the barn so they could find their way back after feeding the animals. If you lost the rope in a whiteout, you were as good as dead. The cold would disorient you, leading to paradoxical undressing, a late-stage hypothermia symptom where the victim feels a false sensation of extreme heat and strips off their clothes, hastening their end. The industrial toil. In the industrial north, the mill girls and iron workers faced a different kind of cold. The factories were massive, unheated brick shells. While the machinery generated some heat, the drafts were lethal. Workers would wrap their feet in burlap sacks and grease, their skin with tallow, to create a barrier against the freezing dampness. The transition from the scorching heat of a blast furnace to the sub-zero air outside caused shivers so violent they could break teeth. Conclusion of Part 6. By midday, the outdoor worker was exhausted, damp, and hungry. The art of layering, we spoke of in Part 2, was now a heavy, wet burden. But as the pale winter sun began to dip toward the horizon, often as early as 3:30 p.m., a new fear set in. It wasn't just the cold anymore. It was the dark. In our next part, we look at the most vulnerable members of the society, the children and the elderly, and how they survived the nights when the mercury dropped to levels that modern thermometers would struggle to measure. The vulnerable. In the winter of 1905, the survival of the fittest wasn't just a theory, it was a nightly reality. While a healthy adult might endure a night in a freezing room with nothing but shiver, for the very young and the very old, the cold was a silent predator. In an era before antibiotics, a simple chest cold in December could become a funeral in January. Today, we look at the quiet, desperate measures taken to protect the vulnerable, those whose internal fires weren't strong enough to fight the great freeze on their own. The nursery, a battle for breath. In the Edwardian home, the nursery was often tucked away in the attic or far corner, rooms that were the hardest to heat. For a mother, winter was a season of constant anxiety. Infant mortality rates spiked during the winter months. The main culprit wasn't just the temperature, but croup and bronchitis. The air in these homes was incredibly dry because of the coal fires, which irritated tiny lungs. To combat this, mothers used bronchitis kettles, long-spouted pots that sat on the fire, sending a constant stream of steam into the room to keep the air moist. If a baby started to wheeze, the remedy was vapor capping or goose grease. A child's chest would be rubbed with thick animal fat and then covered with a warm flannel cloth to seal in the heat. It was messy, it smelled, but it was the only barrier against the congestion that claimed so many lives. The hot brick and the bed warmer. Go to bed was the most dangerous time for the elderly. As the body ages, its ability to regulate temperature weakens. In a room where the temperature might drop to 2 degrees Celsius, 35 degrees Fahrenheit, a senior citizen could easily slip into hypothermia while they slept. The solution was a range of preheating tools. The most common was the hot water bottle. But in 1905, these were made of heavy stoneware or ceramic, not rubber. They were effective but heavy. If you accidentally kicked one in your sleep, it was like being hit by a brick. For those who couldn't afford ceramic bottles, a literal brick was used. A brick would be placed in the oven of the kitchen range all evening until it was glowing with heat. It was then wrapped in multiple layers of old flannel or a thick wool sock and tucked into the bottom of the bed. This hot brick will provide a steady, radiating warmth for 6 to 8 hours, just enough to keep the blood flowing in elderly toes until morning sun rose. The old folk in the chimney corner. In the social hierarchy of the Edwardian winter, the elderly were given the place of honor, the chair closest of fire, known as the chimney corner. They would spend the entire day there, often wrapped in shoulder shawls and lap rugs. Movement was difficult. Arthritis and rheumatism were rampant, and the cold made joints feel like they were filled with broken glass. The elderly would often sit for hours, performing light chores like mending socks or peeling potatoes, staying as close to the coal stove as humanly possible. They were the keepers of memory, telling stories of the great snow of 1881 to the children, teaching the younger generation that while the current winter was bad, they had survived worse. School, the cold commute. For children, the struggle was a journey. Most children walked to school, regardless of the weather. There were no puffer jackets. Girls wore thin cotton stockings and woolen coats, while boys wore short trousers, even in winter, with long wool socks. The schoolhouse itself was often a drafty stone building with a single pot-bellied stove in the center. If you were lucky enough to sit in the front row, you were toasted. If you sat in the back, your ink would freeze in the inkwell. Teachers would often have the children perform drills, jumping jacks and arm swinging, every hour just to keep their circulation moving so they could hold their pens. the captain of the men of death. We cannot talk about the vulnerable without talking about consumption, tuberculosis. In the 1900s, it was the leading cause of death. The irony of the Edwardian winter was that while people huddled together for warmth, they were inadvertently spreading germs in poorly ventilated rooms. The cold weakened the immune system, and the coal smoke irritated the lungs, making people ripe for infection. For the elderly, a winter cough was often the beginning of the end. Families would watch their loved ones grow thinner and paler as the months went by, praying for the spring thaw to bring some relief. Often, the thaw came too late. Class and survival. Class played a brutal role in who survived. In the workhouses, places for the poor, the elderly were often given only the bare minimum of coal and blankets. In contrast, the wealthy elderly had foot warmers lined with fur and rooms heated by multiple fireplaces. The vulnerable poor had to rely on parish relief, small donations of coal or blankets from the church. To be old and poor in 1905 was to live in a state of constant, shivering prayer. The psychological shield. Despite the physical danger, there was a psychological resilience. Children were taught from a young age that feeling the cold was a sign of weakness. They were encouraged to brave it out. This stiff upper lip attitude was a survival mechanism. If you accepted that the cold was your master, you would lose the will to fight. By treating the winter as a character-building exercise, the Edwardians managed to keep their spirits high even when the thermometer was low. Conclusion of Part 7. Protecting the vulnerable took every ounce of the family's energy. But even with the fire going and the bricks heated, there was one thing you couldn't avoid: the basic call of nature. In our next part, we look at the most dreaded experience of the Edwardian winter, a trip to the outdoor privy. Hygiene in the cold. We live in an age where the bathroom is a sanctuary, warm tiles, steaming showers, and indoor plumbing. But in 1905, for the vast majority of people, the bathroom was a drafty wooden shack at the end of the garden. In the middle of a January blizzard at 3 a.m., the call of nature wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an alpine expedition. Today, we dive into the shivering reality of Edwardian hygiene, a world of frozen toilets, the weekly bath, and the absolute struggle to stay civilized when the temperature is working against you. The dreaded outdoor privy. For the working class, indoor toilets were a rare luxury. Most homes had a privy or outhouse. This was a small wooden hut built over a deep pit or a removable bucket. Imagine leaving your warm bed, putting on your boots, and trekking through 6 inches of snow just to sit on a wooden bench that was minus 10 degrees Celsius. There was no soft, quilted toilet paper. Instead, people used old newspapers or almanacs cut into squares and hung on a string. In the winter, the ink from a newspaper would often transfer to your skin, and the paper itself was as stiff as cardboard. But the cold brought a more solid problem. In a deep freeze, the contents of the pit or bucket would freeze solid. This meant the night soil men, the workers who came to empty the toilets, couldn't do their jobs. Families would have to pray for a slight thaw just so their waste could be removed. The chamber pot, the indoor alternative. Because the trip to the outhouse was so brutal, every bedroom had a chamber pot or jerry kept under the bed. This allowed you to avoid the midnight trek through the snow. However, this came with its own set of problems. The smell was contained by a ceramic lid. But in the morning, someone had to carry the slops downstairs, through the kitchen, and out to the privy to empty them. In a particularly cold room, the contents of the chamber pot would actually freeze overnight. Breaking the ice on a chamber pot is a historical reality that most period dramas conveniently forget to show, but was a standard morning chore for the Edwardian housewife or housemaid. The once-a-week bath. In our modern world, we shower daily. In 1905, a full-body bath was a major production that happened once a week, usually on Saturday night. So the family would be clean for church on Sunday. The process was exhausting. First, you had to haul the tin bath out from its hook in the scullery and place it in front of the kitchen range. Then, you had to boil gallons of water on the stove. This took hours. Because coal and water were expensive, the family would share the same bath water. The father, as a breadwinner, usually went first, then the mother, and finally the children in order of age. By the time the youngest child got in, the water was gray, soapy, and lukewarm at best. To stay warm, you had to keep your upper body out of the water and wrap a towel around your shoulders while you scrub your legs. The moment you stepped out of that tin tub, the cold air hit you like a physical blow. You had to dry off and get into your flannel nightgown as fast as humanly possible before your skin turned blue. The sponge in the washstand. On the other 6 days of the week, washing meant using the washstand in the bedroom. This consisted of a large ceramic bowl and a pitcher of water. As we mentioned in Part 5, this water was often frozen in the morning. Once the ice was broken, you would perform a top-and-tail wash. You'd wash your face, your armpits, and your feet. The goal wasn't to feel refreshed. It was simply to remove the soot and sweat of the day. Because the air was so dry and the soap was often harsh, made with lye, skin would become chapped and cracked. The Edwardians used glycerin and rosewater, or plain lard to soothe their bleeding knuckles and faces. Cleanliness in 1905 wasn't about a fresh scent. It was a battle against infection and skin rot. Laundry, the frozen armor. If personal hygiene was hard, keeping clothes clean was even harder. We've talked about the art of layering. But imagine the weight of those clothes when they got wet. In the winter, mud and slush from the streets would cake onto the bottom of long skirts and trousers. Since you couldn't wash heavy wool coats every week, people relied on brushing. Every night, you would use a stiff bristle brush to scrape off the dried mud and horse manure from your coat. For the inner layers, dolly tubs and wringers, mangles, were used. The work was so cold that women's hands would often turn a deep purple red, a condition known as washerwoman's hand. Drying the clothes indoors, as mentioned before, created a damp environment. This humidity, combined with the cold walls, created black mold. The Edwardians didn't know about spores, but they knew the musty smell of winter was a sign of a sickly house. The secret of smelling like a winter. If you could travel back to 1905, the first thing you would notice wasn't the cold, but the smell. Everyone smelled a mixture of coal smoke, damp wool, animal fat from the dripping in lard, and a hint of unwashed skin. But because everyone smelled that way, no one noticed it. It was simply the smell of survival. Perfumes and colognes were used by the wealthy to mask it. But for the common man, his scent was his badge of labor. To be clean in the winter was a luxury that required time and money that most people simply didn't have. Conclusion of Part 8. Despite the grime and the freezing outhouses, the Edwardians maintained a remarkable level of dignity. They polished their boots, they mended their rags, and they kept their black lead stoves shining. But as the hygiene chores finished, the sun would set, and the village would fall into a deep, icy silence. In our next part, we look at the winter industry, how the economy kept moving when the canals were frozen and the roads were blocked. In the modern world, we are bombarded by artificial noise, the hum of electricity, the roar of engines, and the ping of notifications. For a Viking living in the 9th century Arctic, the world was characterized by a profound, almost heavy silence. But to the trained ear, this silence was never empty. It was a language. This section explores the sensory intelligence of the Norse people. To survive the winter, they had to develop a heightened state of environmental awareness that modern humans have almost entirely lost. They didn't just look at the weather. They felt the atmospheric pressure in their joints and tasted the moisture in the air. The most critical sense for a Viking was hearing. In the dark, your eyes can deceive you, but the sound of the ice does not lie. We look at the phenomenon of ice cracking. When temperatures drop rapidly, the ice on a fjord or lake contracts and shatters with sound like a gunshot. A Viking hunter could tell the thickness of the ice and the direction of a developing crack simply by the pitch of sound. This was the difference between a successful crossing and a freezing death in the black water. Furthermore, the howl of the wind to the turf walls of the longhouse served as an early warning system. They could distinguish between a passing squall and the great white death, a blizzard that could last for days. Their sense of smell was equally refined. In an era before chemical pollutants, the air was a canvas of scents. A Viking could smell a snowstorm coming from miles away, the scent of ozone and metallic cold that precede a heavy fall. Within the settlement, Smell was a diagnostic tool. The scent of the hearth fire told them if the wood was damp, indicating future smoke issues, or if the peat was high quality. Even the smell of the livestock in the byre provided information. A change in the scent of the manure could indicate a sick animal, which was a threat to the family's heat source and future food supply. This sensory survival extended to the tactile or touch. Vikings developed a topographical memory. They could navigate familiar paths in total darkness or heavy fog by feeling the slope of the ground beneath their boots and the direction of the wind against their cheeks. This is often referred to as wayfinding. They used the fetch of the wind, the way it feels as it hits an obstacle, to locate their longhouse when visibility was zero. This part of the script emphasizes that the Vikings were not fighting nature. They were reading it. Their bodies had become finely tuned instruments, synchronized with the frequencies of the Arctic. They lived in a state of constant, active listening, a meditative survival mode that kept them one step ahead of frost. When the sky above the Arctic begins to dance with ghostly green and violet fire, a modern person sees the aurora borealis, a collision of solar particles with the Earth's magnetic field. But for a Viking, the sky was a stage for the gods. This section explores the spiritual shield provided by Norse mythology. In the depths of a winter where the sun had abandoned the earth, the Vikings needed a why for their existence. Their myths weren't just stories. They were a psychological framework that turned a terrifying environment into a meaningful, albeit dangerous, landscape. The northern lights were often interpreted through the lens of the Valkyries, the shield maidens of Odin. The flickering lights were believed to be the reflections of their armor as they led the souls of fallen warriors to Valhalla. This interpretation turned a cold, celestial event into a source of inspiration. It reminded the Norsemen that even in the darkest night, the gods were active. Other traditions viewed the lights as the breath of the frost giants or the bridge of Bifrost, connecting the world of men, Midgard, to the realm of the gods, Asgard. By personifying the weather, the Vikings made the Arctic winter something they could negotiate with through ritual and courage, rather than something they should simply fear. This mythological worldview was essential for combating the winter depression we discussed in Part 7. The Vikings believed they were living in the age of the wolf. Their mythology told them that one day a winter would come, the Fimbul Winter, that would never end, leading to the final battle of Ragnarok. Therefore, every spring that arrived was a temporary victory for the gods. This created a culture of extreme stoicism. If the gods themselves were destined to die fighting the cold and the monsters, then a mortal man could surely endure a few months of darkness. This warrior ethos was applied to everyday survival. Stoking the fire was a sacred act. Tending the cattle was a duty to the clan. Enduring the hunger was a test of spirit. We also examined the role of the seeress or vulva. During the winter, she would perform seer, a form of shamanic ritual. In the dim, smoky light of the longhouse, she would enter a trance and travel to other worlds to ask the gods when the thaw would come. These rituals provided a social placebo. They gave the community hope and a sense of control over an uncontrollable environment. The script highlights that survival is 10% physical and 90% mental. The Vikings' ability to see dragons in the sky and gods of wind provided the psychological armor necessary to prevent the cold from freezing their hearts. They didn't just survive the winter. They transformed it into an epic poem.